From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wichman. We start off the week with an update on the cattle market with senior agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Jim Robb. He reports that beef, cow, and heifer slaughter is up significantly year over year, and that packer margins remain strong. We'll also pass along a portion of the latest Beef Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. And this week's youth development feature is all about summer camp. K-State 4-H specialist Pam Van Horn talks about the many benefits that youth experience by attending camp, which started this week and continues all month at Rock Springs 4-H Center. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
Listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. We start off the work week with a look at last week's holiday-shortened cattle markets. Senior agricultural economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Jim Robb, reports that beef cow slaughter is up 12% year over year and that heifer slaughter is up 29%. He also says that packer margins are still strong and that the U.S. tariffs on aluminum and steel coming in from Mexico and Canada are having an impact on U.S. pork exports to Mexico. Jim, starting off, maybe just a review of the markets.
Well, overall, compared to recent weeks where we've had a lot of gyrations in the marketplace, this holiday-shortened week last week was rather tame. We had production levels continuing to post year-over-year increases, 3 to 4% in the range that we've had lately, and cattle prices were pretty flat. Slaughter steer prices were in the 110 to 111 range, which is finally flat week on week. Calf prices are a little hard to peg around the country, and yearlings were starting to have some real small runs, and some of the auction barns were closed because of Memorial Day last week. But if we look overall at yearling prices in winter livestock auction, they were up pretty good, $2 to $5 per hundredweight on those heavyweight 7 to 8 weight steers. Calf prices around the country were in the range of stable, down $2 to up $2 in most markets. So I think overall it was a market that finally got some stability, and it's onward from here.
Are there any drivers in the market?
Well, the drivers in the market are clearly the robust demand. We had the box beef cutout slightly weakened. That's the wholesale beef market last week. But we had, for the holiday shortened week, we had a very good movement during the week. So in other words, we had almost a 5-day or 6-day worth of movement in the holiday shortened week, which is good news. That means that there was some initial replenishing of the stocks at retail and grocery stores. And the other good news is, even though the wholesale market was a little bit softer last week, it's still higher than it was at the first week of May. So we've softened prices, but they're still in a pretty strong range. That means that packer margins are still very strong, and that means that we keep pulling animals through the marketing chain, through the feedlots, at an aggressive pace. Not quite as much as last year, but we've been able to stay ahead of the perceived wall of cattle coming, at least so far, and that's because feedlots have done a great job of marketing animals, and that's mitigated the price declines. Even though they've been rather severe, without the marketing rates, we would have had even larger price declines and probably more pressure in the calf and yearling market than we've seen lately.
There has been a lot of talk about tariffs. What are we seeing along those lines? Is that having any impact?
Well, we've had, a real round of responses, especially by the NAFTA countries. That would be Canada and Mexico, with the White House announcement of putting tariffs on aluminum imports by the United States and steel imports. Canada, even though there's a lot of rhetoric there, not a lot of direct impacts in terms of their retaliation at this point in terms of the meat marketplace, and specifically not with respect to the beef marketplace. The bigger story has been in the short term with respect to Mexico. Mexico is placing very large tariffs on U.S. pork products. And Mexico is our largest pork market in the world. So, and that means that we're going to have more trouble exporting to Mexico. The prices will be higher for Mexican buyers. And that's raised a lot of concern, along with the overall rhetoric in the marketplace, where we are very dependent on exports across the board. So the beef impacts will be mostly indirect. If we don't consume the pork, is not sold to Mexican customers, we have to consume it in the United States, and these are basically fresh products. So, this is a concern because there are spillback impacts on the beef marketplace. But, this has really been the rhetoric of the last few days of last week, and we expect some of these gyrations to continue. And we've seen most of the volatility, especially in the futures market as opposed to the cash market, at least so far.
At this point, though, that doesn't really change how the producers do their jobs.
At this point, it really doesn't. We need to keep an eye on these big picture things that can shake up the industry, but we need to continue from a producer's perspective of doing our summer management and keeping things rolling. So, this is a time to try to not pay too much attention to the extraneous things and keep our eye on the ball a little bit for producers.
You have been tracking slaughter data. What did you find out this week?
USDA puts out what we call actual slaughter data, and it's about a 2-week delay, but I think there's some real key points in last week's data. On the slaughter side, we had overall cow slaughter up 9,000 head year over year. That's a 9% increase. But most of the increase has been in beef cow slaughter. We had a 12% year over year increase in the latest data, which would be for the week ending May 19th, in terms of beef cow slaughter. So clearly we have open beef cows, clearly we have drought conditions, and we're increasing beef cow slaughter a little bit more than we anticipated a couple months ago. More importantly, heifer slaughter last week was up in the actual data 33,000 head year over year, which is a 29% year over year increase. Now, it won't stay at those levels, but we're now have ratcheted up heifer slaughter to levels that when we put heifer slaughter and cow slaughter together, it's starting to give us some signs as the second half of 2018 develops in terms of the size of our overall herd. And it's probably growing a little bit slower pace than we thought even a month ago.
Is that surprising?
A bit surprising, yes. A 29% year-over-year increase in anything in agriculture, let alone in heifer slaughter, and we're not comparing to a funny week a year ago, is a huge increase. So we were on track probably for a year-over-year increase in the overall U.S. cattle herd on January 1, 2019, up maybe 0.5%, where last year it was up 0.7%, and the year before up nearly 2%. We may be fading that if we stay on this pace of both beef cow slaughter and heifer slaughter. So we still see a year-over-year increase, but it looks like it would be less than 0.5%, which is a real moderation in rate of growth in that overall beef cow herd and the overall U.S. cattle population. And when we look further down the road into the second half of 19 and into 20, this will be beneficial from a supply perspective in terms of cattle prices.
What then should producers be thinking about in terms of how they market their cattle?
Well, I think in terms of marketing cattle, we don't want to get caught up, especially in ranching country, too much with the short term. We want to look to the fourth quarter of this year. We can have some real gyrations this summer. We have a lot of moving parts, both politically and corn crop, et cetera, drought conditions. But we want to focus, and we want to look a little in a management sense, in cow-calf country especially, and in stocker country, looking at the year ahead. It's not too early to do that. And again, with this sort of changing profile in terms of the inventory, there's probably a little bit more optimism out in 19 and 20 than we thought a couple months ago. So it's not too early to start some fundamental business planning, looking out a little bit more longer term. In the short term here, we have many producers that are really struggling with drought, and those decisions are, week to week and sequential. And we need to really stay on top of that because we still have a larger calf crop that was born here in 2018 than we did a year ago. So we still have plenty of cattle out there, even though the bigger picture is starting to reshape here as we get into spring this year and probably throughout this summer.
Feed costs are already high. I'm assuming with the drought they could go higher.
Absolutely. We've seen hay prices across many markets up to levels that they haven't been at in several years. Hay is a very regional crop, but if we need feedstuffs, we have to watch that closely. We've had corn uptick here recently. We've had soybean meal costs running well above a year ago. So in terms of purchase feedstuffs, in terms of managing our forage on ranches and stocker operations, real close attention to those aspects are going to be very economically important, I think, this summer and potentially into 2019.
Anything in the next week or two that could impact the markets?
Well, you never know what's going to be politically announced out of Washington, D.C., and those can, again, really cause some volatility, especially in the futures market. So we probably want to, be aware that those things are going to happen or could happen, but maybe not try to overreact to that. There are no big USDA reports right here in the very near term, so we're really going to be watching the crop development on the weekly crop reports, et cetera, which has been pretty good. The initial corn conditions have been very favorable, even better than last year. But we need to watch that very closely in the months ahead.
Jim, if somebody wants to find out more information, how can they find information from your site?
Well, our website is www.lmic.info, and we're proud to be a partner with Kansas State University and 29 other land-grant universities supporting unbiased and timely market information for the livestock and poultry sectors.
Well, you guys do a great job, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
That's Senior Agricultural Economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Jim Robb, with this week's Cattle Market Report. Again, for more information, visit lmic.info, lmic.info. And to listen to Agriculture Today anytime, visit agtoday.net, where you can listen on demand and find links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher Radio. Once you've subscribed, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today. Time now for a portion of the latest podcast from veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, and livestock economist Dustin Pendell from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State as they discuss lead topics on cattle production and health management. Here's Brad to kick off this week's Beef Cattle Chat.
Hi, welcome to BCI Cattle Chat. I'm Brad White and happy to be joined today by Dr. Bob Weaber, Dr. Dustin Pendell, and Dr. Bob Larson. We're happy you're joining us again for this edition, and today we're going to have some discussion on some email that we received from some of our listeners, as well as early weaning, the length of the breeding season. Before we jump in, I'd like to invite you to contact us if you have questions or thoughts or stories you would like us to talk about. You can email us at bci@ksu.edu, or you can visit our website at www.beefcattleinstitute.com. And we'd be happy to get questions from you at that time. Speaking of questions, Dustin, you got a question or some feedback on one of the stories that we talked about last week. You want to talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. So in the story we were talking about last week was related to BRD, a study that came out with a colleague of mine back earlier this spring. We were looking at what are the impacts, economic impacts, if we were able to reduce BRD through some different technologies. And summarize, what we found was cattle producers, because if we remove BRD, we increase beef supply. If you increase beef supply, assuming we're not changing anything else, no change in consumer demand, puts downward pressure on prices. So more supply, prices go down, producers don't benefit. And that's kind of what we found. Where consumers actually benefit because prices go down.
Yeah, more supply.
And if you take that all combined together, in that society, we're better off.
And the value proposition to the consumer is better, right? Yeah.
And the question, I guess, the comment and question from our listener said, why don't producers benefit if we get rid of it? In fact, some producers will benefit. If you have it and you're able to get rid of it, you will be better off. Now, if you're a producer who maybe doesn't have BRD, and now all of a sudden the prices go down and you're not benefit by getting rid of BRD, you're going to be worse off.
It just seems odd, but we kind of know that if in pens of cattle where I have a lot of BRD, I'll make a lot more money if I have less. But in those pens of cattle that don't really have any respiratory disease, that are doing great, there's no real benefit.
Right.
And actually some potential downward pressure if the other pen puts more supply on the market.
Absolutely. And so producers can benefit. I mean, some producers will lose. But then there's also the time component of it. If you take a look at, we modeled this out over, I don't know if it was 20 quarters or 40 quarters, but the beef producers actually lose an aggregate. We're talking individual, but on an aggregate in the first few quarters. But then by the last half of our study, actually the beef producers were much better off.
Gain again.
Yeah. And so, again, there's a dynamic, a time component, a temporal component to this, but then it's also thinking about an aggregate of beef producers versus individual beef producers. And
so what can be good for me isn't necessarily good for the entire industry and vice versa.
Exactly.
And it's a little like cost to gain, right? If you're average in the industry, you're probably break-even-ish, right? But if you do a better job feeding, a better job managing, or a better job, in this case, controlling BRD than the average producer, then you get the cost savings of that without necessarily suffering from, because it's the sort of macro-micro thing, right?
Right. No, that's exactly it. I think you got to think the macro versus the individual micro level.
Yeah. Nationwide is a little bit different. And that was, I think, one of the things that we got some feedback on, and hopefully that clarifies a little bit, because BRD is still one of the biggest costing or expense disease, especially to individual producers in the industry, and trying to manage it is important. But if we look at what happens nationally, I think it's important as we think about those control techniques. One of the other comments that we got from a listener, and this one more of a correction, Bob, you want to?
Yeah, just a correction on the value of early weaning. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about, I was out on my parents' grass pastures this weekend, and it's really shockingly underproductive, let's say.
Yeah, we had the same thing. We had some hay made and got about a third of what we normally get off that small patch so far.
I think for the next few weeks we're going to be talking about strategies for dealing with low forage production, but we overstated a little bit the value of weaning a calf is actually 2 days of being weaned gives you 1 extra day of that cow having forage. So if I wean a calf for 2 weeks earlier than I would have typically, I'll gain an extra week of cow grazing. If I weaned a calf a month earlier, I'd gain an extra 2 weeks in that cow grazing.
And that's based on you reducing her requirements?
Reducing her, yeah. The calf is consuming some dry matter, but a lot of it has to do with, as soon as you take away lactation, that you're decreasing her maintenance cost.
And as far as some of the other parts of early weaning that we talked about, and we talked about getting those calves off the cow, we talked a little bit about the health management, and no real health concerns.
I've gotten the opportunity to work with producers that have done early weaning on calves, and I've always been actually pretty pleased with how well those calves do. But a lot of times it has to do with the fact that the producer and the veterinarian got together and kind of made a plan heading into it. So it started the vaccinations on the calves a little bit earlier, had a place and a plan for, and usually those calves are weaned on farm. They're not going to be necessarily trucked anywhere. And so they're going to
fence line weaning work. Good strategy.
Exactly.
Make them really low stress.
That may be harder to do at another time of year. We can actually sometimes accomplish if we're going to wean and keep those calves on premises for a while.
And that's a great thing to think about is creating that plan. One of the other things we spend a lot of time planning for is the breeding season, and we see different things come out, and you talk about the length of the breeding season. A lot of people will promote a 60-day breeding season or a 90-day breeding season. What do you guys think about that? Is that the right amount of time? Because people that put out bulls May 1, we'd be pulling those bulls 1st of July. Is that what you recommend?
The idea of constraining breeding season usually is a reflection of somebody wanting to constrain calving season, right? And so not calve forever, right? Or 6 months or a year-long calving season. The economics of building a replacement female are substantial. And so I think maybe in Bob Larson, I'd like your take on this too. Maybe the better strategy is not necessarily pull bulls earlier, do a better job in terms of pregnancy diagnosis and aging those pregnancies, and then maybe culling some of those later bred cows. Because we know a bred cow, even in the fall, is worth more than an open cow in the fall. And so if we create open cows because we pulled bulls too soon, that's sort of shame on us, right? And we have an economic loss when we do that.
I agree. I think some of the thought process is these cows that calve late are not going to return. I mean, the calves are not going to be as heavy. They just haven't been alive as many days. So those cows that calve late aren't going to be as generate as much income as a cow that calves early. So that is a true statement. I'd like to get as many cows calving early as possible. But at the same time, what I'd really like to do is replace that late bred cow with an earlier bred heifer at an appropriate percentage of the herd, but have that cow be bred. So I'm agreeing, I think, with both of you that I don't really recommend going out and pulling the bulls after 60 days out of the breeding pasture. First of all, a lot of times that's very inconvenient to go out first part of July and try to separate a bull off and get him off the pasture.
Well, then what do you do with him?
And then what do you do with him? I'd just as soon leave him out there. And if there are some cows that are still coming in heat, that we go ahead and get them mated and make them pregnant cows, but have the discipline to move them off the operation as a pregnant cow to someone else's operation that maybe they fit better, and replace those with bred heifers that I bred up earlier that are going to make my herd be more front-end loaded, more of the cattle calving early. I'd rather my culls be pregnant than open.
Yeah, but just because they don't fit your calving season doesn't mean they don't fit somebody else's.
Right.
Yeah.
But differentiate between the breeding season and the calving season.
Yeah.
What we care about is the calving season, and that's where the economics come. And some of the articles that have come out say those late calving cows are a slow drain on the herd, or they pull down the herd. Absolutely. We want a short calving season. That doesn't mean we have to have a short breeding season. We can have a long breeding season and preg check to sort those out.
But that does also bring up that maybe we need to make sure we preg check early enough to identify really which those are. And that doesn't have to be
How early are you talking?
Well, it depends.
It depends.
That's a good academic answer.
That's the great answer.
Can you give a number for...
But basically, we start losing our accuracy when you're out more than about 100 days.
Now, accuracy, you mean as far as being able to stage to 21-day breaks, not picking up a pregnancy.
Exactly. The bigger the pregnancy is, actually, the easier it is to find, but it's you're less able to accurately say how far along in gestation that cow is.
Yeah.
And so basically what you're looking at is, I want those late-bred cows to be 120 days or less when I palpate them. So we're not talking about a particularly early palpation, but early enough where I can for sure tell those cows that were bred after the middle of July or the first part of July.
So May breeding, you may be looking at preg check in September, October, November, depending on where you are.
Yeah, basically usually don't let it slip into late November or December. It becomes really difficult to differentiate, those late-bred cows.
Yep. So I think that preg check...
Ultrasound?
Well, if you do ultrasound, interestingly enough, works best for those early pregnancies.
So move them...
Yeah,
go into maybe late August or something.
Yeah, ultrasound doesn't really help me for a December preg check.
Right.
They're just
too far in the
They're too far along.
That's a portion of the Beef Cattle Chat podcast from veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, and livestock economist Dustin Pendell from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. For more information, visit ksu.bci.org. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wichman. As part of a 33-year effort to protect sensitive lands and improve water quality and wildlife habitat on private lands, the U.S. Department of Agriculture will resume accepting applications for the Voluntary Conservation Reserve Program. Eligible farmers, ranchers, and private landowners can sign up their local farm service agency between now and August 17th. U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue says that the Conservation Reserve Program is an important component of the suite of voluntary conservation programs that USDA makes available to agricultural producers, benefiting both the land and wildlife. On the road, he says that he often hears firsthand how popular CRP is for the recreational sector, hunters, fishermen, conservationists, and birdwatchers. Perdue says CRP also is a powerful tool to engage agricultural producers to set aside unproductive marginal lands that should not be farmed to reduce soil erosion, improve water quality, provide habitat for wildlife, and boost soil health. For this year's sign-up, limited priority practices are available for continuous enrollment. They include grassed waterways, filter strips, riparian buffers, wetland restoration, and others. You can view a full list of practices at fsa.usda.gov. FSA will use updated soil rental rates to make annual rental payments reflecting current values. It will not offer incentive payments as part of the new sign-up. USDA will not open a general sign-up this year. However, a one-year extension will be offered to existing CRP participants with expiring contracts of 14 years or less. Producers eligible for an extension will receive a letter with more information. Again, for more information, fsa.usda.gov. Well, the Farm Bill was a primary focus of U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue's visit to Kansas last week. In response to a question about what he'd like to see in the Farm Bill, the Ag Secretary pointed to crop insurance.
I think it's a good deal for the American taxpayer. I'm one of these people that believe that our citizens in the United States enjoy some of the healthiest, most nutritious, most affordable, and the best food in the world. It allows us to spend a significant less percentage of our disposable income in the U.S. than any other developed country. That means we can go do other things with it. We need to expand that into some of the specialty crops. The other issue that probably can't be dealt with in the Farm Bill, but is a real issue in farm land, and that's the legal workforce. We've got a real situation with a lack of farm workers today. Farmer population, no offense everybody, but you're getting older, and we've got a real dearth of farm workers and of farm labor, not so much in maybe the grain growing areas, but in all the vegetable production and fruits and vegetables and those kind of things. But even on the farms here in Kansas, you need a reliable, legal immigrant workforce.
As for agricultural trade, Perdue is optimistic that NAFTA will get done.
We know that Kansans like NAFTA because it's been really good for export, both Mexico particularly and Canada. NAFTA is a big deal. Trade is a big deal. I'm more optimistic. You heard me say earlier today, I'm more optimistic about getting NAFTA done, particularly with Mexico. The Farm Bill in 2014 gave the USDA an opportunity to create the position of Undersecretary for Trade, and that was not implemented until we got there. And I realized I've been in agribusiness all my life, in grain trade, for instance, and I recognized how important it was having somebody merchandising your crop, having somebody selling. So we've had Ted McKinney, who was the Director of Ag in Indiana, and on the road since he got there last year, knocking on doors, India and Japan and Korea and China a few times, making sure they know what kind of products you all produce and how we can sell more.
U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue also stressed the importance of agricultural research and the need to improve broadband to rural communities. 6 Kansas FFA members were elected last week to serve as the 2018-19 state FFA officers at the 90th Kansas FFA Convention on the Kansas State University campus. They were among 11 candidates running for a state officer position to represent more than 9,000 Kansas FFA members. The 2018-19 Kansas FFA officer team includes President Max Harmon, Inman FFA, Vice President Michael Dowd, Spring Hill FFA, Secretary Skylar Zinger, Washington Washington County FFA, Treasurer Kristen Isle, Coffeyville FFA, Reporter Miranda Deppenbush, Udall FFA, and Sentinel Garrett Craig, Clay Center FFA. The state FFA officer team will travel across the state sharing their passion for agriculture, leadership, and service. Kansas FFA officers present workshops and conferences across the state and challenge FFA members to serve their communities and the agriculture industry. The Kansas FFA Association is a statewide organization of nearly 10,000 agricultural education students in nearly 200 chapters in every corner of the state. To learn more about each new FFA officer, go to kansasffaconvention.wordpress.com. kansasffaconvention.wordpress.com. Well, if your pine tree needles have brown tips, needle blight could be the cause. In this week's Tree Tales, Health and Conservation Forester with the Kansas Forest Service, Ryan Armbrust, says this is a good time to treat infected pine trees with a fungicide.
We may call them evergreens, but that doesn't mean our pine trees hold their needles forever. In fact, pines are deciduous, in a manner of speaking. It's just that they drop their old needles after several years, instead of an annual leaf drop. This process is normal, as the trees grow out into the sunlight, and old needles on the interior of the tree become shaded and produce less energy. However, premature needle drop can sometimes leave pines weakened, with less needle surface area to photosynthesize for the tree. On many pines in Kansas, including Austrian and ponderosa pines, premature needle drop is caused by a fungus called Dothostroma. This needle blight causes needles to drop from the tree the year after infection, and since these pines usually hold their needles for 3 to 4 growing seasons, the loss of 2-year-old needles is a significant problem, and repeated needle loss can cause loss of vigor, decline, and death. Dothostroma can be identified by the characteristic browning of just the ends of the interior needles. Removal of old needles from under the tree can help, as can increasing air circulation around the tree, but this is perhaps impractical in a windbreak. An application of a copper-based fungicide in early June has shown good control, and better control can be achieved with applications in mid-May and late June. But perhaps the best bet is to plant a resistant type of pine in the first place, such as a Rocky Mountain source ponderosa pine or southwestern white pine. It's best to always keep in mind that planting a diverse mix of trees will also help reduce the risk of a large-scale mortality from a pathogen like Dothostroma or many other insects and diseases that threaten our trees. I'm Ryan Armbrust, Forest Health and Conservation Forester with the Kansas Forest Service, and this has been another Tree Tale.
And that's a look at today's agricultural news. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Protecting and preserving the nation's water supply is critical to our economic future and human health. Current irrigation trends could deplete 69% of the groundwater in the Ogallala Aquifer within 50 years. The top 8 Kansas counties for agricultural production are located in western Kansas, which overlies the aquifer. Those counties contribute about 1/3 of the total agricultural revenue for Kansas. Water is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing by contributing to the 50-year water policy process and advancing efficient irrigation and water monitoring systems for farm and home use. For more information, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
When a thunderstorm approaches, follow these safety tips. Lightning, known as the underrated killer, usually strikes the tallest objects, so avoid standing beneath trees or other isolated tall objects. Take shelter in a sturdy building. Remember, if you're close enough to hear thunder, you're close enough to be struck by lightning. Help keep you and your family safe this severe weather season. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
This is Agriculture Today. Well, it's June, and for many 4-H youth, that means several days camping at Rock Springs 4-H Center. K-State 4-H specialist Pam Van Horn says this is no ordinary camp.
Campers are there 4 days and 3 nights, and it's just a wonderful, exciting time for 4-H members to go to Rock Springs.
It really is kind of a revolving door, as you mentioned. It's like one group comes in, they're there for their 4 days, and then the next group comes in, and it just keeps going throughout the entire month. The really nice thing about this, though, is the fact that they are exposed to so many things during that short time.
That is so true. They'll have opportunities to go horseback riding, canoes, mountain bikes. They do a leadership adventure course. They have archery and shotgun and rifles. And then, of course, swimming in the swimming pool, which is spring water in there. So it's a little chilly sometimes.
And it's a little bit rustic, too, because for the most part, they are outdoors.
They're outdoors. The kids are walking all the time from the activities. It's a great opportunity for them just to be out in the fresh air, and many of them may not be spending that much time outdoors anymore.
I remember when my son went the first year, he was talking about, they had us fixing breakfast. They had us doing dishes.
Maybe not to that extent. It's called KP, and the campers get the opportunity to serve their fellow campers or their campmates, and they will set the table, bring the food to the table, and then help clean up. But they're not fixing the meals and washing dishes. That's the Rock Springs staff, which...
Are you saying that he fibbed to me?
He might have exaggerated a bit.
I can't imagine my son doing that. He really had a great time, though, because I was telling you before we started that when we picked him up, he barely made it 2 miles off the property before he was just completely out.
There is so much going on. They're up early having breakfast, probably at 7:30, and then they start going to activities, and then they'll go swimming, and in the evenings there'll be activities that the agents have planned, whether that might be something that they sit down and watch in the auditorium, or it may be a scavenger hunt that they're running all over campgrounds. And of course, campers, even though we have lights out, that doesn't mean they go to sleep. So it's a great fun time to learn more about themselves and to meet others.
Well, that's one of the important aspects, I think, is learning how to get along with others and how to work on projects together.
I think the beauty of camp is watching the camp groups come together. Sometimes they don't know their other campmates, and they'll become friends very quickly. And by the end of camp, you would have thought they had known each other for life because they've done things together that have been lifelong learning things, whether it's keeping track of their clothing items or trying to get to the schedule. But many times campers, that's the first time they've been away from their parents, so they do a little growing up while they're at camp.
Well, and there are some rules and regulations that they have to follow, and I think one of those is no cell phones.
It depends on the camp group, but usually the campers don't have their cell phones. Maybe the counselors do, but it really doesn't matter at Rock Springs because self-service is not the best at Rock Springs.
Well, it's just one of those things that you have to keep track of, and probably better if you can to just leave it at home.
It's better to leave it at home because, you get more out of it when you're fully invested in the activity you're doing. And you can forget about what's going on at home. And it really helps with homesickness if you don't have your cell phone.
One of the things I remember is that there's kind of a checklist for the parents and the campers so that they make sure that they do have the things that they do need.
Yes, many of the camp groups will have a little checklist, and it'll help parents to decide what needs to go and what doesn't need to go. Because you can always overpack. But it's important to have shoes and shorts and long pants and sunscreen and insect repellent.
And as I remember, there is someone who is in charge of making sure that the medication is taken care of.
Yes, there is a nurse that makes sure that all our campers are well taken care of so they don't have to go off their medication schedules.
Now, if somebody is interested in this, can they still get into a camp?
They would have to contact their local extension office and see if there's still availability. It may be hard-pressed at this point, but if you miss the deadline this year, be sure to mark it on your calendar and be thinking about it a year in advance.
I think you're right, because it is something that is really memorable. My son still talks about it today.
Oh, I mean, there's campers. We all love Rock Springs if we went to Rock Springs as a camper. But I think it's one of those memorable things. That is where we did a little growing up. In 4 days, you really changed. I've heard parents say, I left off my child and I got a different child when I came back because they had grown up. They had become a little more responsible or a little more outgoing.
And for some parents, it's kind of a learning experience for them, too.
Oh, I think that is a true statement in the fact that sometimes parents need this opportunity to really grow and know that they have taught their child well and that they can function on their own without them. So, yes, it is a growing for the child and for the parent.
And for those who might be new to 4-H, this is a premier facility.
Oh, Rock Springs is one of the best in the nation, and I have been to some of the other states' campgrounds, and I think Rock Springs is something we in Kansas take for granted because it is so nice. The facilities are wonderful. It's really hard-pressed to find a campgrounds as nice as we have it at Rock Springs.
And the camp counselors, many of them have been through the camp themselves.
Oh, many of the camp counselors, they have been selected by the local offices, and they were campers themselves. And so, there's things that they learned as campers, and they just want to share that back with the new generation of campers.
And if people want to find out information about the camps, they can check this out on the website just to get some background information.
Get some background information on the 4-H website, or even check out the Kansas 4-H Foundation on Rock Springs. And to find more out about camps in their communities, contact the local extension office, and I'm sure the agents will share the information with them.
And that's a good point, because there will be some camps going on that are not at Rock Springs during the summer.
Yes, there are some camps that other counties have that are individual, and there may be something that they're offering. The other thing to check out on the Kansas 4-H Foundation webpage is that there's family camps that happen in July and August. So check those out, because that would be an introduction. If you miss the camp date this year for 4-H camp, maybe go as a family.
That's K-State 4-H specialist Pam Van Horn. To learn more about Kansas 4-H, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.